Welcome to the AP Econ Semester Review. This is for the 2020 AP exam, and today we're going to cover Unit 1 for Micro and Part 1 of Unit 1 for Macro. If you remember, Micro is just Chapters 1 and 2. For Macro, it's Chapters 1, 2, and 3, and 17. So Part 2 will actually cover Chapter 3 and Chapter 17, but this review video is just going to cover chapters 1 and 2. So we'll cover Micro Unit 1 and Part 1 of Macro Unit 1 in today's session. Glad you're with me. Are you living the 5? Let's live the 5. Here we go. Chapter 1, looking at first principles. So it's important as we launch into this to look at the key economic assumptions. Remember, ceteris paribus. We have to assume that all other things are equal, that we're looking through a lens of a telescope, if you will. We're not looking at the entire universe. We're just looking at particular stars, particular aspects. We have to assume everything else is ceteris paribus, or kind of all other things equal, kind of freeze framing everything else around it. We also have to assume that people are acting rationally. Now, we know most people don't always act rationally, but the idea is that when it comes to consumers' spending decisions, when it comes to governments and spending decisions, we have to think that they're going to act in a way that's going to make sense. So if we can't do that, then we can't look at any models because the whole idea here is we're going to explain them through graphs. And if we don't have rational thought involved, people do think rationally, but we know that there's a lot of exceptions to that rule. And so the point is we're trying to think that they're going to act rationally in a way that makes sense. Also, they're going to act in a way that is helping them in acting in their own self-interest. They're going to act in ways that are going to help make them better off. And we have to assume that based on what we call perfect information, which we know is less than perfect. We're also going to assume that there aren't any other outside costs. There's no other transportation costs or costs of getting things up to speed. We're going to assume that there aren't other costs involved. Whatever are the costs that are involved in building this, that there aren't other external factors that are weighing in on what we're going to be taking a look at. That's important to note, because when we're looking at businesses and decision making that businesses are having here, or that governments are making in the macro side, we're assuming that there are no other outside costs in making that. And lastly, we're assuming a big assumption here, but we're assuming that we can explain a lot of real life situations, whether that's in micro or in macro, through simplified models and graphs. That those key graphs that we look at, the 42 in micro, the 37 in macro, that these are real life simplifications of different transactions and choices that are taking place. So we have to make those assumptions in order to better understand how and why people do the things that they do. Okay, so we move on to this idea of individual choice. People are going to act rationally in making decisions, and that they're going to act in their own self-interest. So some basic principles behind this. Why do they have to buy things? Well, because resources are scarce. Why are there differing costs based on how much they're being supplied, or how much there is demand around them? Because of scarcity. The idea that we have to make choices because of scarcity. We can't buy everything we want. We can't have everything we've ever dreamed of. We have to buy it, and those things cost money in one way, shape, or form. Those resources, even a business, has to do a cost-benefit analysis in terms of determining what is they are capable of buying at the moment. So resources are scarce. Also, we have to understand that we're going to probably give something up in order to get what we want. So there's going to be a long list probably, of lots of things that we want. But the choices that we make in terms of picking off of that list, we're going to be giving other things up in return. Okay? We're also going to be making a how much decision, or what we call this decision making at the margin. This idea that we're going to buy a little bit of this, a lot of this, and maybe some of this, and a lot more of this. So we're making a lot of how much decisions. How long do we go for a ride in the car? How far do we go? How long do we continue to press the snooze button on the alarm clock until we get up? All of those decisions are made at the margin. And then again, we're going to take advantage of decisions that are going to help make us better off, because we know that resources are scarce. Resources, let's talk about that for a second. They're land, labor, capital, the resources we typically look at. Land, more like natural resources. Think of that in terms of things like trees and water and the land, as we mentioned. But those are all natural resources, things that aren't necessarily products you can just make. That would be more the products. But these are things that may be capital intensive, as we look at in macro. In order to pull oil out of the ground, requires a lot of capital resources, a lot of machinery and tools to refine that material and turn it into oil or gas. And there are scarce resources in terms of making that happen. Now, labor is an example of a human resource. Those are people, the people that we need in order to make the burgers at McDonald's, or to check us out at Walmart when we're trying to pay at the register. Those are all examples of labor or human resources. And then we have capital resources. These are the buildings. These are the machines. These are the resources that are used to make products and services. So computers, for instance, would be a capital resource for a business that may engage in tax preparation services or something along those lines. Capital can take very many different forms. Capital can be the tables and chairs in a restaurant. They can be the counter at the Subway restaurant where people move along the line and tell the worker what you want on your sandwich. All of those things are different types of capital, and we know that resources are scarce in terms of these types of goods that we need, these resources that we want available. And so we have to make choices about whether, and again at the margin, about whether we need a lot of them, a few of them. And again, we make some decisions about what do we need right now and what can we put off until later. That's an opportunity cost. The idea here is we make trade-offs. Trade-offs essentially are like opportunity costs. I always tell students, think of opportunity cost as the opportunity lost. Now, we know all costs ultimately will be opportunity costs, but the idea is you're making trade-offs, and the opportunity cost is that second place choice, that idea of the opportunity you're giving up in order to get the first choice that you made. The cost of attending an economics class. What are you giving up in terms of sleep, watching TV, rock climbing, taking another class? All of those things are opportunity costs that we see here. Now, marginal decision making is this idea of making that trade-off in terms of how much more am I going to pursue economics if it's of interest. I might take another class in college. I might take several classes. I might major in economics. Major marginal decisions that we make there. And how much of a class do we attend? Do we come in late? Do we come in with lunch? Do we come in at lunch and to take advantage of lunch and learn? Do we come in for period 8 and take advantage of asking Mr. Rodman questions and getting questions answered? All of that sort of thing is marginal decision making in terms of making those trade-offs. Who are you gonna eat lunch with? There's a trade-off there. You're making decisions about which friends you're going to have lunch with, or where you're going to go for lunch. All of those are trade-offs, decisions made at the margin as they're actually happening. And this marginal analysis is essentially the study of these types of decisions. Do I hire one more worker? Do I buy one more cookie? How do I make those decisions? Well, we make them at the margin. We're in the back of our mind, rationalizing the costs, the benefits, and then making a decision based on that. Well, how do we decide on those decisions? We look at incentives. People respond to incentives. The idea here is that if there's a sale, we respond to those incentives for a sale, or maybe I've got a coupon for getting half off of an item. That is going to be an incentive to change my behavior, to reward my behavior in order to change that. People respond to incentives all the time, and we see this in terms of the price of gasoline. We see this in terms of different jobs that are well paid or those that aren't. Those incentives or disincentives really do matter here. And the interaction of these choices is really the idea of what we're looking at in economics. The idea here is that there is a gain from trade. The principle that's underlying this is that there is a gain to be made from this. By getting a great deal on a product, we're getting the product in return. We have to understand that markets are moving towards equilibrium. This idea that supply and demand is going to meet, the buyer and the seller are going to meet at a place where they can agree upon a price, where a market is created. That's equilibrium. And that we're using our resources efficiently. The idea here is, again, no outside transportation costs. Remember the assumptions we talked about. But the idea here is we're trying to achieve society's goals and to do that efficiently. And the market is going to move towards that efficiency. And when they don't, government's going to step in. And a good example of this is traffic jams. When traffic jams occur, government steps in to say, hey, how can we resolve these types of issues? This is the idea of individual choices and the markets that are created as a result of them, and then what government involvement there is, or if any, as a result of these decisions that are being made. But again, the importance here is that there are gains from trade, and that you can get more of what you're looking for if you have those gains from trade. You can go out and make Pepsi in a bathtub, but why would you when you could get it for a much better price at the local Costco or Walmart or even the Giant, and get a much better price as a result? So we decide to specialize. This idea of specialization, we're going to specialize in particular tasks that we're good at, things that we have an advantage in producing. Ultimately, we would talk about that as the absolute advantage, which we'll get to later. But the idea here is we're going to specialize because we're going to produce more as a result of our specialization that then we can use to trade with others. So, for example, a teacher doesn't work in a factory line. The whole idea is the teacher teaches, and by that specialization, they can teach many students, and as a result of that, they can get paid, and then they can go out and buy what is produced on a factory line, a product that they can buy at a local retail shop or on Amazon. So that's the idea of specialization. But the economy is moving towards equilibrium. The idea of where buyers and sellers are finding places where they are better off. And a good example of this is the checkout line. When a new line opens at the Giant, what do? Well, we very quickly in our head figure out, am I closer to getting through this line, or would I be better off going to that line? And how many people are in front of me? And can I beat them to the line, or is there going to be, a problem with it? Am I going to get behind a person? How many people am I going to get behind? How many people are going to get in front of me? All of these decisions we make in split seconds in order to determine whether we stay in the line we're in or whether we go to the other line. All of this is the idea of moving towards equilibrium. We make those split-second decisions very quickly, but in markets, we make these decisions by the thousands every day in terms of the types of decisions that are made moving towards equilibrium. We try and aim for that efficiency, but we're not always efficient in those resources. Sometimes the cost-benefit analysis is a result of, hey, I have a craving for one of those white chocolate macadamia nut cookies that Subway is offering, and so maybe I give up something in order to get that in return. Okay, going to get less mayo on my sandwich this time. Going to have that, and maybe I'm going to skip dinner or eat a salad for dinner or something along those lines, so I can have that white macadamia nut cookie. And that's always the idea of moving towards efficiency, trying to make us better off. We may not necessarily be better off with that cookie, but the idea is the economy is moving towards efficiency by conducting that cost-benefit analysis wherever we are as a result of that. Now, sometimes the economy is not always efficient, and this is where equity comes in, that equitable strategy in order to try and create an environment that is more equal or more fair in nature. It doesn't mean that it's perfectly equal. Sometimes it also means that it's giving some people or some businesses or some organizations more of a start up in order to help give a level playing field from which to start from. So some businesses need a little more help. That's why government contractors always try and award some of the contracts that they have to minority-owned businesses, and the idea of doing that is to provide some equity in terms of that. And sometimes the contracts they have, or the contracts that are open to bidding, they'll look at it and say, are you a minority-owned business? Because that is additional points in the overall scoring card to determine how we can be more equitable in awarding contracts to minority-owned businesses and that sort of thing. This is the idea of striving for equity, but it's very different than efficiency because again, while people are better off in an efficient type of mindset, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's always fair. And so this is a good example of what I just mentioned with the contracts in trying to, and this is the one we've seen kind of on social media where the three kids are standing behind a baseball field trying to watch the game, and they're all of different sizes. One may need a box to stand on, one may not need a box at all, and another one needs a really big box because they're so short in order to see over the fence, in order to see the game. This is the idea of equity. This is the idea of equitable strategies, really trying to help those that need a little extra help along the way. And I use the lambing example all the time. Some lambs have to be brought into the kitchen on my farm and tubed and given the nutrients that the mother would have given them, but the mother abandoned them because she had triplets and only has enough milk for two. So this is the idea of tubing them and milking them, feeding them, and until they can get an equal level playing field to be able to go out into the field and eat off of the land. So this is another equitable strategy that we see here. And in markets, governments really step in to do this a lot in terms of trying to make things fairer in economic situations. Now we know not everything's efficient in a marketplace, and we have a lot of market failure. We have a lot of times where either resources are wasted or the outcome isn't what we anticipated. And that does happen from time to time. A good example of this is traffic jams. I think Krugman mentions the freeways in LA in terms of that inefficiency. But this is the idea of market failure. We have something that's happening in which supply and demand don't meet. And as a result of this, we have a side effect, which is the idea that markets fail in this regard. And that's unfortunate because the idea here is that you want to be in a situation in which government can have a positive impact on the marketplace, but it doesn't always happen. And this is where we get into these externalities, these side effects that are really important for government to step in terms of leveling the playing field, but it doesn't always happen that way. And that is unfortunate in terms of making that happen. Okay, so then we move on to Chapter 2 then. That's Chapter 1. So let's look at trade-offs in trade as we close out the Unit 1 for micro and Part 1 of Unit 1 for macro. So we look at and we use models, as we talked about in the key assumptions. We use models or simplified representations to look at real-life situations. We use the ceteris paribus assumption that other things equal. We're looking through the telescope at the planet or the star that we're focused on, not necessarily all the stars. We're not going to see all the stars in the universe tonight. We're going to look at particular aspects through the telescope of that particular star or planet we want to take a look at. That makes the biggest difference here. Also keep in mind, we're looking at a production possibilities frontier or a PPF or a PPC, production possibilities curve. This is to show us the trade-offs that we're making either as an individual, as a business, or as a country in terms of what we're producing, what we're actually doing with our resources. This is a simplified version because we're looking at two goods in this case, but the idea is there are trade-offs in doing more of one good than the other, and we have to know that there is going to be a trade-off, a decision-making process in that place, and it's going to hopefully benefit us in the decisions we make. And if it doesn't, then we probably will go back and make different decisions next time in terms of making this happen. So a simplified version of the production possibilities curve or frontier shows us here, Krugman talking about coconuts and fish. The idea behind this is that you have A, where you're producing more coconuts than fish, and B, in which you're producing more fish than coconuts, and C, where you're not producing as many coconuts and fish that you are capable of producing because you really should be on the curve somewhere. So you are inefficiently using your resources at C. And D is currently not feasible. It's not possible to produce at D. Now someday the PPF may shift outward with new technology and innovation that gets us to D on the curve, but for now it's not a feasible option. It's not a realistic expectation there. So in this example, as you can see, there's increasing opportunity cost to produce more of one and less of another. You're giving up some coconuts in return for producing more fish, and vice versa. You're giving up more fish in order to produce more coconuts. But the idea here is that you're making trade-offs. You're making decisions at the margin, and hopefully those decisions will be to your benefit. And if they're not, then you'll change those decisions down the road. Okay, so as I mentioned, a lot of times sometimes economic growth through innovation and new technologies or new technological improvements can actually shift the curve outward. And we can see this here. Maybe new technologies in catching fish lead to a greater quantity of fish that can be produced, and then new technology in terms of coconuts, not as great as the fish model, not improving our yield of coconuts as much as fish, but the idea is it's pushing out the curve. This is the idea of innovation and technology improving the capability, the production possibilities of this frontier. So the book, the Krugman text, Krugman mentions the idea of this fish and coconuts in Tom's consumption without trade. He can produce 9 coconuts and 28 fish. And the idea that Hank can produce 8 coconuts and 6 fish. But if they work together and they specialize and they find where they have the best options, and where they have the lowest opportunity cost, they can find out that they can actually work together and specialize in trade. And there are gains from trade as a result of this. So in this example, we see Tom's opportunity cost is only 3/4 of a coconut in terms of producing fish, where Hank's is 2 coconuts. So it's better for Tom to probably to gather the fishing, because he's giving up fewer coconuts than Hank would be in this instance. So that would be his comparative advantage. Now Hank's opportunity cost is only half of a fish in terms of gathering coconuts, where Tom's is 1 1/3 fish or 4/3 fish in terms of that. So Hank should specialize in gathering coconuts, while Tom should specialize in fish. And those gains from trade as a result of the idea here is that it's a win-win for both of them, because they're both working together on this island to do what they're good at, and specializing in what they're better at than the other, and than the other product. They will benefit as a result of this, and there will be specialization and gains from trade as a result of this. So this is the idea that consumption with trade and without trade, he obviously can consume more. Now you can't consume. You can't produce beyond your PPC, but you can consume beyond your PPC as a result of this, and we can see that Tom is able to do that. He's able to consume beyond his PPC because of this, and Hank's able to do the same. Because of that specialization, there are gains from trade as a result of this. And this leads to this discussion about comparative advantage. Now, absolute advantage is the easy one, right? Who can produce more or gather more than anybody else? That's the absolute advantage. But the comparative advantage is who can produce the good at a lower opportunity cost of producing that good that is lower for that individual than for others. And that's kind of the example we just went through with Tom and Hank. So by having the comparative advantage, we can see Tom has the lower opportunity cost in producing fish, and Hank the lower opportunity cost in producing coconuts. And because of that gains from trade, each one of them is better off as a result. So we see the same thing here on the macro economy when it comes to a country deciding, well, what are we better at? In this example, the United States can produce more pork, 3 million quantities of pork, and 1,500 aircraft. Now, you're like, aircraft and pork, you can't really compare the two. But when you're looking at another economy, sure you can, in terms of that gains from trade. Canada probably can't produce as much pork as we see here, but maybe more aircraft as a result, and there are gains from trade as a result of this. So just like with Tom and Hank, you can see that Canada will concentrate on aircraft, while the U.S. produces pork and exports it to the United States. Everybody wins because of the gains from trade that we see here. If you haven't seen this sheet, kind of the trick or the cheat sheet on comparative advantage, there are 2 methods, what we call the IOU and what I call the OOO method. So very simple to calculate them, and comparative advantage is always a popular model when it comes to questions on the AP exam. But the input method is how much time is it going to take to produce a resource. So that is kind of the input, how much resources go into that in terms of of creating the product. And in this case, it's time. So what we see here is Ty and Jessica are mowing versus trimming. It's going to take Ty 60 minutes to mow versus Jessica 75 minutes. But it's going to take Ty 40 minutes to trim, and it's going to take Jessica 90 minutes to trim. So it's taking Jessica longer to do both. Ty has the absolute advantage in both of these exercises. But in the comparative advantage, we see that Ty has an opportunity cost of essentially 1.5, because input other under is what's happening here. So the other number goes under the amount of time that you're mowing here. And so 60 over 40, which simplifies to 3/2. The opportunity cost for Ty in mowing here would be 3/2 versus the 5/6 for Jessica in terms of mowing lawns. And so as a result of this, Jessica should mow the lawns, and she should specialize in that. Now, Ty, on the other hand, has a comparative advantage because he has a lower opportunity cost in trimming. He can sacrifice 2/3 of mowing in order to trim, where Jessica would be giving up 1 1/5 of that mowing in order to trim. And so as a result, Ty should trim the lawns, Jessica should mow the lawns, and there are gains from trade as a result of this. So this is the input method that we see, or the IOU method, and is a popular way of gauging the comparative advantage based on inputs or resources that go into it. The other method, the OOO method, or the output other over, is in products produced. So if they're talking about the final product that's being produced, this is where you'd want to use the output method, or the OOO, and this is in radios and speakers. So Mark and Doreen here are producing radios and speakers, and we can see here, moving through the output other over, that Mark has an opportunity cost of 1/3 speakers in order to install radios, where Doreen has 1/2. So Mark has the comparative advantage over Doreen in installing radios. Now over here in speakers, Mark, it costs him 3 radios to install a speaker, but it costs Doreen 2 radios to install a speaker, and therefore Doreen has the comparative advantage in installing speakers. So Mark should install radios, Doreen should install speakers. There are gains from trade by specializing. Everybody wins as a result of this, and we find that very helpful in terms of calculating the OOO method of comparative advantage. Now, moving on to the circular flow as we round out the chapter, the idea here is that you have different transactions taking place or flowing throughout the economy. I always tell students the easiest way to think about this is that the economy begins and ends with you. I used to have a friend who would always say, I am the center of my universe. And in the circular flow, it is true, because you are the center of the circular flow. The idea is you as a consumer, you as a human resource, as a laborer, you basically affect a lot of what's happening in this circular flow. The idea of you being a household, you will then sell your services as a human resource, either producing goods or services, and selling to the company those resources. They're paying you for those, and then they sell those to the marketplace. They sell those to firms. Firms then will pay for those goods and services with cash, and then the firms will actually pay the households, the factor markets, essentially you being a factor market here. And as a result of that, you will get money from those companies, those firms that you're paying for, and then you will go out and buy different goods and services in order to produce, in order to get the things you need. Again, cost-benefit analysis. But the idea is the same in that whether you're a consumer or whether you're a factor market, a factor of production, being a human resource, you have a huge impact on both of those. Because if you're not going out and spending money, then businesses aren't buying those resources. And if you're not participating as a resource, then businesses aren't able to utilize and sell your resources to other consumers and other businesses that then they can make money off of and pay you back, that you can then use to go and spend more money out in the economy. economy. So it's really important in terms of this circular flow. When we're looking at households, they're spending money for goods and services. Who are they buying those from? They're buying them from firms. Firms are then paying resources, like you as a human resource, for those resources. Those resources then are turned into factors of production that are sold by firms through goods and services that people are then buying, and those goods and services go to households. So it really is a flow that begins and ends with you. Okay, and then this just talks about the different types of pieces of the circular flow model we talked about here. A household essentially being a consumer, a firm being a business, the market for goods and services, essentially the selling aspect where those goods and services are sold, and then the factor markets being the factors of production, the natural resources, human resources, and capital resources that we talked about earlier. Okay, rounding out the chapter then, as we use models, it's important to note the difference between positive economics, the way the economy actually works, and normative, kind of the way it should work. So that's an important aspect. We hear about the normative aspects of economics all the time. How should the economy be working? But in reality, there's a lot more positive economics that we'll take a look at in terms of how it actually works. But these forecasts are really important to keep us back in line with how do we fix a problem like inflation. We just talked about this in chapter 33. How do we solve a problem like inflation? Well, we tie it back to the way the economy should work in terms of the impact that the Fed would have on interest rates in order to drive down aggregate price levels, in order to try and keep inflation at bay, in order to sell bonds in terms of slowing the economy down to keep aggregate price levels low. But those forecasts come about because of economists looking at the idea of how the economy is actually working and how it really should work. As a result of that. So it's so important to look at this from the perspective of the value judgments that economists are making all the time. And they're making decisions too. Cost-benefit analysis. The Fed is looking at how low should we lower interest rates? How low can we go before we get into a Japan liquidity trap type of situation? But this is important in terms of those aspects. I hope you found this helpful. This is the end of Micro Unit 1 and the end of Part 1 for Macro Unit 1. So I will see you in Unit 2 of each of those respectively in the next video, depending on which one you're watching. But live the 5, have a great day, and we will see you soon.